Hello, and welcome to Chai Can't Even, a Faith Unfiltered podcast series that could easily be called Why I Stay. It's no secret that church attendance for all denominations in America has been declining since the late 1970s. But recent studies show the largest generational drop is among those born between 1981 and 1996, the millennials. And yes, this series usually features interviews with young folks born in that era. But occasionally, we chat with older adults who journeyed with Community of Christ over decades of innovation and change and chose to hang in there, even when family and friends did not. And we want to hear their story about why they stayed. Today, I'm here with David Wilson, a lifelong Community of Christ member who remains vitally active in this faith movement. Welcome, David. We're so glad to have you today.
Well, thank you, Robin.
So we'd like you to tell us just a little bit about you, some of the basics about where you live and what an average day in the life of David looks like.
Well, I live in Findlay, Ohio. I have 3 children, Xanth, who is my stepson, and his wife, Sonia, Zara, my daughter, Xanth is 36, my daughter is 30, and Zara, and she has a friend, Kayla. And then my son, Zedric, is 24. So I'm very proud of them and where they are in their lives at this point. I retired from Marathon Petroleum about 6 years ago. I was an IT professional there and currently work a part-time job at a golf course. And if you like to golf, it's a great gig because free golf comes along with it.
That sounds amazing. I have a son-in-law that would be all over that free golfing stuff. So, David, we want to start at the beginning of your story and just really get a flavor of what it was like to grow up in Community of Christ during the post-World War II, Leave It to Beaver era of the church. So tell us all about that.
So I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and grew up in Livonia. My parents were both church members. I go back like 3 or 4 generations on both sides. My mother was Canadian. I always say, I could say, as Nephi said in the Book of Mormon, that he was born of goodly parents. As far as I know, I was at a reunion every year of my life. We went to Blue Water when I was little, and then when I was about 5 years old, we went up to Minettville, Ontario, to Northern Ontario reunion because my dad was in summer school, and the only time we could go as a family was to the reunion in Northern Ontario because it was late enough in the summer that we were able to attend together. Growing up, I can remember when I was young that we didn't play cards on Sunday, or at least my parents didn't. My grandfather wasn't a member, and so he could play cards with me on Sunday when I was little. And at some point, we discontinued that practice and played cards every day of the week. And I don't recall when that happened, but that was kind of the early thoughts at that time. I remember being in Spanish Ontario after Northern Ontario reunion one year, and Apostle Aaliyah Curry and his family were there as well for a few days of vacation before they headed back to Independence. And on Sunday morning, before preaching, Aaliyah was out fishing. And we had never fished on Sunday. But if the apostle could fish on Sunday, then we could fish on Sunday too. I told Art Smith one time that he didn't realize what kind of power he had, and he didn't think he had that kind of power anymore, like they used to. But I was baptized at 8. I was ordained to priest at 17. We were always at pretty much, if the church building was open, we were there. At that time, that would have been Sunday morning, Sunday evening services, and Wednesday night prayer services. And my parents sang in the choir, and I also began singing in the choir at a pretty young age. I remember one time we were over visiting my grandparents in Windsor, Ontario, and there was, church that evening, and my parents were like, well, we have to get back for, Sunday night church. And I wasn't thrilled with that idea. And my mom was like, well, if we're not there, there might not be anybody there. And my thought was, then why are we having church on Sunday night if nobody's coming? And of course, and eventually, those services did get dropped because of lack of attendance. I attended Zioneers and Zion's League at church, which were the junior high and senior high youth groups at the time. I went to Zion's League summer camp for 3 years when I was that age. Again, that was a senior high age group. We had a program called Youth Venture for Christ in Detroit, which was a time where we would get together during the year, 4 different weekends, and study about the church and do some home visiting, put on the service at the congregation on Sunday, and we prepared to go on a trip in the summer where we would put on a vacation Bible school during the summer. And during the years that I went, we went to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, Moline, Illinois, and Chicago, Illinois. And when we were in Chicago and Moline, we did a nighttime Bible school. And so we also had an adult class, which we had different people take one night. And I taught an adult class one night on the differences between our church and the Mormon church, which was all about showing why we were right and they were wrong at a time. And today, I know that most of the arguments that were made would not hold up to historical scrutiny. But at the time, that was really a lot about who we were, in that we were not the Mormons. We were not those people that practiced polygamy and became gods and did things that we thought were just kind of weird. And I guess that's about all I have on that.
I want to ask just a couple follow-up questions. You mentioned that your family was super active when the doors were open. You were there. Was that the norm for a lot of families in the church as you were growing up in your early years?
I would say that, so the congregation I went to was about Detroit Center probably had, well, when I was younger, about 150 members. And then later on, we merged with another congregation. And so it went up to between 200 and 250 members on a given Sunday. I would say out of that group, there were maybe 30 core members, I would say, that usually went to Wednesday night services, 30 to 40 maybe. But the majority of people were still Sunday morning goers, and the Sunday night services, like I said, they eventually discontinued. There might be 20 people that would go to those. It wasn't very big.
That's interesting information to have. And then your youth venture for Christ and other activities as a youth you were engaged with. What was the level of attendance looking like then for you?
So the first year that I did Youth Venture for Christ, we actually did 2 different churches in Pennsylvania. We were in Punxsutawney and Du Bois, which were about 20 miles apart, and did a Bible school in each one of those. I think we had about 70 kids that participated. And as the years went on, the last 2 years, we were probably down to between 40 and 50.
Mm-hmm.
But still, very good participation. And well, like Detroit's reunions at the time, we had 2 reunions in Detroit International Stake, and we would have between 400 and 500 people at each reunion.
Yeah.
And a Zion's League camp would have 50 to 60 kids at probably.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of get a sense of the attendance levels. And we have to remember, I'm a little older than you, but we do represent the baby boomer generation when, that post-World War II boom. And that's a demographic that has changed a lot of numbers as we look at things and data points. And sometimes we forget that. So anyway, it's interesting to kind of get that and re-experience that in a way as you share your story. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the culture and context of what it was like being a kid in the church. How were you treated as a kid in your congregation? And like, who were your mentors? What stands out to you as you look back on that time?
So I was an only child, and I always tell people it gets worse. I was an only grandchild on one side. So um, I was always kind of included by my parents, like if they had people over. So I was very comfortable talking with adults and that, and was always treated well at church. Now, we were still at a time where, you know, priesthood members participated in services. We didn't have non priesthood reading a scripture or giving a prayer. It was pretty much always priesthood that participated. Um, one of the men who was a mentor for me, Dan Kelty. He was like our junior high uh, teacher, and he taught church history. And one of the people that gave me a great love for church history. But Dan also would invite the youth to go visiting. We used to have a Tuesday night home visiting program, and he'd invite the youth to go and pair them up with a priesthood member and send them out to go visit. And so we were involved in the congregation in that way. um, I was thinking some of my other mentors. So my parents were pretty conservative, and I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, which was a very non-diverse community, very white. And my neighbors, the Livelies, who were church members, they just lived two doors down, were our league leaders, our Zion's league leaders, and they were very involved in race relations, in women's rights, and in like nuclear disarmament. And so I got some of the understanding of that I didn't receive like in my home life, as far as understand some of the more delicate um, intricacies, I guess, of those issues. Um, I also grew up I remember in 1967, Detroit had some of the worst race riots in the country that have ever occurred. And so, I didn't understand the issues that led to those kind of things. It was just kind of taught to me at the time as being, some people just reacting violently for no real reason and burning, half the city down. So,
Right, right.
so I really appreciated the Livelies in my life and showing me and helping me to understand some of the issues that led to things like the riots. Um, Don and Phyllis Thomas were part of our Youth Venture for Christ leadership team, and were mentors for me. Bob Murray Jr., who um, was part of that Youth Venture for Christ leadership team also. And it's kind of ironic now because he eventually became an apostle in the remnant church of Jesus Christ. but but I just have some great memories of Bob. He was an incredible minister. And then Doug Bolger from Northern Ontario. Um, he was a youth leader when I was a teen up in Northern Ontario, and as I grew a little older and into my early 20s, he gave me responsibility of teaching a junior high class and leading youth worship services. And Doug has been to this day, is a great friend of mine. And he even came down and ordained me to the office of elder, traveling, the 600 miles or so from Northern Ontario. He blessed my children and performed our marriage ceremony. So he was been a great influence in my life.
I love that. And he's a great guy. You talk about a lot of great people, as you mentioned, your mentors. One interesting thing, you talked about Dan Kelty and that he was really proactive and um, what I understood to be including young people like yourself and partnering with priesthood members when they would go visiting or that kind of thing, integrating you into a broader scope of church life. Was that happening primarily for males like you, or were they beginning to include girls in that kind of thing?
I think it was only boys. I
Yeah,
don't recall any girls going,
yeah. I,
which
I
is
mean,
kind of a shame. But what I'm thinking, Dan always talked about how our pastor at the time wasn't really on board with sending these young people out
hmm.
until Dan invited his son, the pastor's son, to
Uh-huh.
go, and then he thought it was a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it's important for us to understand as we look back on your journey and the journey of others in your demographic age-wise in the church, that the world was very, very different. And in the U.S. context and globally too, there's a lot of social unrest, civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, there was a huge pushback on war and a lot of demonstrations for peace, just all kinds of stuff. And of course, we see the second wave feminism coming through at that same time. So there's just all kinds of stuff happening in your world as you are responding to Christ's call and already ordained a priest. That's terrific. So you've talked a little bit about, some things kind of creeping in with changes with youth being included to accompany priesthood members as they do some things in the life of the congregation. As you look back kind of from this juncture, are there any changes in the church that you recall of note as you were growing up as a young boy in elementary school or during that high school time at all?
I don't really remember a whole lot. Now, one of the things that was going on in Detroit, and I think it was pretty much limited to the Detroit International State, was like I mentioned earlier, our congregation joined with one of the other congregations in the state. They closed it and moved them in. Was our apostle at the time was Will Timms, and he had this idea of what he called power centers. So it's kind of like what we would talk about as signal communities today. So in Detroit International State, they closed Parkside and merged them with Redford, which were two of actually the larger congregations in the state, to form Detroit Center. And the hope was that people would move close to the church building and, raise their families kind of in community together. That didn't happen. For one thing, the area around the church wasn't the best um, as far as uh, the community went. They had, drug problems and things like that right around the community or around the church. But also, they built the Windsor Center at the time, and Windsor um, built a multiple purpose building rather than just a chapel, and um, and property around it with the idea of developing that property so people could move by the church, which again didn't happen. And in Plymouth, they did the same thing. They built a church, had some property around it. Um, so that was one thing that was going on in Detroit, was hoping to build these power centers, or like I said, signal communities. Um, as far as at the world church level, I don't really recall a whole lot going on. I mean, I heard about the new curriculum, which, some people weren't happy with what they perceived as liberal tendencies in the church and taking in, and I also remember about, hearing about somebody was getting their master's in religion or something, and that was considered by some to be a bad thing because they were getting too educated and wouldn't be listening to the Spirit anymore, which was something I never understood. As a church that has in their canon of Scripture that the glory of God is intelligence, I never quite understood why they would think that that was a bad thing. I do remember, I was just thinking about this last night. I think it was something like a health ministries day, a special Sunday that the church had set aside to talk about, ministry to third world countries, where we could do some good with health ministries. And in one of our congregations in the stake, there was a woman who presented, who was a nurse and presented that day at that congregation. At the end of the service, the man who was in charge got up and said, well, if this wasn't a special day, the church would be in apostasy today, because they had a woman speaking from the pulpit. So there was already, there was some of the concern about the direction of the church from that angle. I also remember one of the first times I realized that there were some people who were unhappy with some things was when our pastor from up front of the church said something to the effect of all the crap that was coming out of independence. And it was shortly after the presidential papers had been leaked, some papers that were presented as really discussion points on certain theological issues that got some people bent out of shape because they didn't follow some of the things that we had practiced in the past or had professed in the past. And there's a man by the name of Greg Dauerman who actually makes an appearance. His name makes an appearance in Mark Shearer's history book. Greg was a conservative. He was a convert to the church who became a high priest and was on the Stake High Council in Detroit. And he was fairly wealthy. And I can remember being at Greg and June Donovan's house with my parents, and they were talking about, with the change from W. Wallace to Wallace B. Smith as president of the church, that they thought that would be a good change because they were thinking that Wallace B. was more conservative than his father was. But Greg, there a few years later, there was a restoration festival held at Graceland College, University now, that brought conservatives together to not to just preach the old Jerusalem gospel, I guess you would say. It wasn't a protest in the sense of they were, speaking against anything that the world church was going, but they were still there to kind of make their point that this was what should be being preached. And I always think that that president of Graceland at the time, Frank Huff, did not make any friends down in Independence when he allowed Greg to rent the facility at Graceland to put on his restoration festival. But that was something my parents went to, and I can remember I was at Graceland at the time, and I went to a couple of the services that they had as well. So
That's really fascinating. Really, really fascinating. Um, yeah, things are kind of heating up. And you are graduating from high school in the late 80s and moving into your young adult phase. And you've really given us a good backdrop of, what is happening at that time um, across the church. So let's continue your story from here and tell us about the next decade. You're in college. How does life unfold for you?
So I went to Graceland, and I loved my time at Graceland. I just have so many lifelong friends from my 4 years at Graceland. While I was there, I was a house chaplain. Everett Graffio was the campus chaplain my first 2 years, and then he got called to the Quorum of 12 Apostles, and Rick Bunch came in after Everett. They both gave excellent leadership um, to the ministries program there at Graceland. And I think back to, because I hear now that there's maybe 300 Community of Christ members at Graceland, or maybe not even that many. And at the time I was there, Graceland was probably in the 80 to 90% of being Community of Christ members. And 600, 700 people on Sunday morning worship service was not unusual. I became a house president my junior year while I was at Graceland, so excellent opportunities to get some leadership skills. And like I said, I just loved my time at Graceland. When I left Graceland, I got a job at Marathon Oil Company here in Findlay, Ohio, where I worked for 40 years. And one of the things, though, in the next decade or so was something I didn't really mention earlier, but I was a church kid. My friends were in the church. I didn't go to parties. Was kind of, my parents kind of said, well, you don't put yourself in a position where you might, be pressured to drink or things like that. So even as I was at Marathon those first few years, I didn't go out very often with coworkers. And so that was kind of a lonely time. I can remember my week at Reunion in Northern Ontario tended to be one of those things that got me through the rest of the year. And I just loved my time up there, and it helped get me through some lonely times. So in 1984, I was the first time as a delegate at World Conference, and section 156, the women in the priesthood in the temple, was presented, to the conference, and that caused divisiveness in my family as well as, of course, the church. So my mother was absolutely against it from the moment she heard it. My dad actually voted for it at World Conference. But when he got to the congregation in Detroit, where they went in Detroit Center, there were some strong conservative leaders in that congregation that convinced my dad that he got caught up in the moment, and that, it was not of God, and that we shouldn't be ordaining women. So my parents, so Detroit Center, where they went to church, became kind of the conservative congregation in Detroit International Stake. And people from other congregations that weren't happy with what was going on with women in the priesthood would come to Detroit Center and worship there. And so that went along for a couple of years. And then there was a couple who had been going to the Plymouth congregation who returned to Detroit Center. And in the meantime, she had been ordained an elder. And I can remember talking to Zola Johnstone, who was the wife of our bishop, Alan Johnstone, and they were very good friends with my parents. And Zola said, well, I think everything will be okay. And I said, Zola, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. I said, George, who was the pastor at the time, is going to refuse to use Linda in priesthood. And at some point, Linda's going to push back, and it's going to force the hand of the stake president, Jim Hanna. And I said, and they're going to walk. And by the middle of March, there was a big meeting at the church, and about, I don't know, probably pretty close to half the congregation left and started a restoration branch. So um, that was definitely a struggling time for me as I watched my parents leave the church that they had loved and worshiped in for so many years. At some point, I kind of came to the understanding that it was not much different than if they were Lutheran or Methodist or something like that, that we just belonged to different churches. And while we didn't share that faith that we had shared so many years, we still remained a pretty close family. So then as we went along in that decade, one summer up at Reunion, we practiced Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We practiced all week long, and then in the fall, we put it on at the Ontario Regional Conference. And how that kind of fits into my story is that when I was back in Findlay, the Fort Findlay Playhouse was doing Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And one of my coworkers who knew that I had participated in that up in Canada said, "Well, you've done this before. You should go try out." And so I had been telling my friends up north that I was thinking of doing this, and they were encouraging me to try out for the play. And I can remember calling the director before auditions and saying, "Well, I'm going to be gone for a week during the rehearsal schedule. Would that preclude me from being cast?" Because I thought this was my out. This was my way. I didn't have to go and do that. And she said, "Well, no, I wouldn't preclude you." And she later talked about how she's like, "I needed 13 men. We're definitely not leaving somebody off just because they're going to be gone for a few days." So I went and got cast, and that ended up being a life-changing moment for me. Being involved with the theater community, I learned that people who drank and smoke were not bad people. It's a very diverse community. So I had friends who were gay. I guess it's kind of like I probably always had friends who were gay. That's just that they were, closeted. Grew up in a time that, very few people admitted to that because of the amount of persecution they would receive for being gay. But it just changed my life. I went from this person who didn't leave his apartment very much to being very involved in the theater community in Findlay and becoming much more outgoing, and then eventually met my wife there. So that was life-changing for me.
Yeah, I bet it was. Um, that's an amazing story. And I love the way you describe your engagement in the theater community. And of course, you're a wonderfully gifted person, and it really allowed you to liberate a lot of giftedness that maybe you hadn't before. But then to walk into this new context and culture, meeting people, working side by side with them, and understanding that things that the church did not affirm, like use of alcohol, smoking, etc., and that people that are very different and our brothers and sisters who are gay and weren't able to even be honest about that during that time to build relationship first and deep relationship and then understand the inclusive nature of God's grace, so to speak, and people are people. I think the way you describe that is transforming. I mean, what a shift in your world lens, your view of the world taking place.
Well, a woman who became one of my closest friends told me that one of the first parties that I went to, with the theater group, she came over and was talking to me, and she said, "So I hear you've done this show before." And she said, my answer was, "Yep." And she said, "In Canada?" And I said, "Yep." She said, "I thought you were a real snob." Didn't realize I was just that much of an introvert at that time in my life.
Uh-huh. Okay, I want to take a little sidebar here and talk about something, just explore something, and that is kind of a slice of insight into the dating norms and expectations of church culture, community of Christ culture during those years, because, early in your childhood, um, without a doubt, there was a heavy bias and expectation for young people to date within the church. And at some point, there was a shift, I'm sure. But so, how would you describe the expectation in your life and growing up and dating years of who you dated? Was there an expectation or bias that you only date church members? Were there any dating norms at all or expectations? And was that a different expectation depending on your gender?
Well, for me, when it came to dating, I had a hard time asking anybody out. I didn't have a whole lot of security in myself, I guess. But there definitely was, a focus on dating church members. I remember my cousin was dating a Catholic girl, and my cousin wasn't active in church at the time. He actually became active later in life, but um, my parents were not happy that he was dating this Catholic girl, who, eventually they ended up loving
Hmm.
greatly. And matter of fact, she joined Community of Christ at some point during her life journey as well. But um, so there definitely was that thought. Um, I remember talking with Lou Shepardson, and he said up where he was from in New Liskeard, Ontario, he said they thought that was just ridiculous because that was their best evangelical tool, was to marry somebody who wasn't a member and then convert them. So
Hmm. Hmm.
because I remember, what was it? I think it was said, you were weak in the faith if you married outside the church or something like that, which
Yeah.
I didn't really understand that either. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I remember my mom talking about the pressure and among her peers, males, it was quasi fine for a male to date outside the church because patriarchy was so heavy at that time that the expectation would be that that wife would come with him and be converted to our church. And with women, that was, a roll of the dice. So women dating outside the church, it was this had a special negative stigma at the time. Obviously, as time has gone on, that is not even a consideration. I hear nothing about that now. How about you?
yeah, no, I don't hear anything about that. When I was engaged to Heather, somebody asked me if I thought she'd join the church, and I said no. And my
Uh-huh.
mom's like, "Oh, don't say that." I was like, "I'm just being honest. I didn't see that as something that was going to ever interest her."
Yeah. Okay, so we've got you into married life now and starting to have kids and career and all the things, and you're obviously still very, very much engaged in the life of the church. And so I want to shift a little bit and go into um, listing off the changes that you've seen. And we'll start about that time when you got married. So uh, did you get married before or after 1984?
After,
Okay.
quite a ways after.
Okay. So you've seen the
So,
door
so
the
I would
door
say,
open for women to the
yeah,
priesthood. Yeah.
the women in the priesthood, obviously, which had a big impact. The one true church,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, we used to do a skit at campfire where we'd say St. Peter's welcoming people into heaven, and he says to them, well, when you go past the first door on the right, be quiet. And 2 or 3 people go in, and the next person comes up and says, why are we supposed to be quiet when we go past the first door on the right? And he says, well, that's because that's where the RLDS are, and they think they're the only ones up here. And I said, we'd all laugh, but there was a lot more truth to that than we really wanted to admit at that time. And it's like, and when I think about that, looking back, I mean, as a kid, I can remember thinking, how lucky was I to be born into the one true church, the one church that God is working with. And how when we kind of started to make that theological shift, which I guess began a lot sooner, at least at the, I think at the leadership level than it did at the membership level. It just made sense to me to looking at people like, looking back at someone like Martin Luther King, who made such an impact in the world. And, I think of Mother Teresa and these people doing good works in fighting oppression and poverty, that it just made sense that we didn't hold all truth. So I think one of the things I listed too was the New Mormon history.
Yeah.
One day, one evening, we were playing cards. I was playing cards at my parents' house, and my mom says to my dad, "Well, tell David what you did at school the other day." My dad said, "Well, I heard that in history class they were talking about Mormonism and saying that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. So I took in the story of the church to show them that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist." And I said, "Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest." And my dad was like, "Oh, and I said the conversation didn't go well from that point on, but just starting to understand, because for so many, I think when I was growing up, our history was our theology in a lot of ways. And for a lot of people, when they learned some things that occurred in our history that we had either not known about or decided not to talk about, that, their faith kind of crumbled. Mm-hmm. And I can remember Dick Howard being at Reunion teaching a history class. And the thing that he just constantly pounded into us is he was talking about some things that many of us had not heard or understood before was, our history is not our theology. And that it's important to make sure we remember, why we're here. It's not because of anything that happened in the past so much as to the mission that, that lays ahead and the relationship with Jesus Christ. So then I guess I would say open communion was one of the definite changes that happened in the church. Again, to me, something that just made sense. I can remember, actually, I mentioned him earlier, Doug Bolger, talking about there was a young man who, worshiped with them in New Liskard for many years, was dating one of the members, and was a faithful Christian of another denomination, and he always had to walk past him when he was serving communion. And he said one Sunday he really felt the need to serve him. So he, so as not to disrupt the service or anybody who was there, he said after the service he took him into the pastor's study and offered him communion at that point, and and he accepted it. So in some ways, I guess from Doug's experience with Jody in that situation, and again, just the thought that, we don't hold all truth in our church, that it just made sense to me that we should open up communion to other people. Then I guess the name change was another thing. And, that was, I didn't have any issues with us changing our name. It took me a while to get past saying Community of Christ. We used to be the Organized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to the point where now I don't even think about, saying anything other than Community of Christ. Of course, we're 25, 26 years past that point from once we officially changed our name, but that's what I am now, as a member of Community of Christ. And I was acceptance of baptisms of other. Again, it flows back to the one true church concept that we've moved away from. And of course, I know that you're involved now with the theology formation team, with studying baptism and the idea of whether or not we should accept those who were baptized before the age of 8. Mm-hmm. And I don't envy you in your task, because I know it brings up a lot of different theological questions. But again, I just didn't have any issue with acceptance of baptism. And for a long time, it just made sense to me, though, that it should be a baptism of someone past the age of 8. And until I had a conversation with a friend who said, she would join Community of Christ if they'd accept her baptism, but they won't because it's infant. And she said, but I did make a decision when I was confirmed. And so, that makes me stop and think again. Mm-hmm. And then the acceptance of the LGBTQ community in full fellowship with the church. And that reminds me of a conversation I had with my dad. We really didn't talk religion at all for years. And so they were at my house for Christmas, and my dad said to me, so you're going to this U.S. conference, that's coming up, the national conference? I said, yeah. He says, you know what you're voting on? I said, well, yeah. He says, how are you going to vote? And I said, well, I don't think you really want to know. And he kind of started in on me with, some different things. And I just looked at him. I said, Dad, I'm sorry, but my God doesn't discriminate against people because of their DNA. Mm-hmm. And he went on for a little while, and I just kind of like, you're not going to change my mind on this. I also had an experience going back to my days when I was active in the Playhouse in Findlay. There was a young man who we were talking, and we'd been in a play or two together, but I wouldn't call him a close friend. But we were just standing there talking, and he just said, he says, well, I told my mother that I was gay today. And he said, and she kind of started talking about some scriptures and different things, and saying, well, have you ever tried being with a woman? And, how can, and he said, I finally said, Mom, I said, do you think I choose to be this way? He said, do you think I don't hear people make fun of me, when I'm delivering flowers for my florist friend or different ways? He says, do you really think I choose to be like this? And then he said to me, he says, I don't know that I can ever tell my dad. And it just kind of broke my heart. And I always say, I'd like to say I became an ally of the LGBTQA community at that point, but I really can't say that. But it did give me a different understanding of what they go through, and also then, that the genetic link that deals with sexuality. Mm-hmm. As well. My daughter also had some high school friends. Well, and my daughter would identify as asexual, but she had high school friends who were trans and gay, and they were just kids trying to survive. And so it gave me a much greater understanding of the community than I had before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I like that you pointed out the one true church thing early on in this, because giving up that sense of the one true church was such a game changer, because we linked to that. It was inextricably linked that our priesthood was the one true priesthood that had direct authority from God to officiate in the stead of Christ. And that just was connected to so many things in the life of the church. And as we unraveled that, it was like, well, if this, then that, and oh my gosh, now we have to think about this. And it's just it really led to opening our eyes to a lot of things. And I think becoming a much more welcoming church, opening communion to all who wish to participate. And that was a big thing. And we had listening circles about that. We had lots and lots of conversation. We lost people when we opened the communion table. One thing that we skipped was the Smith lineage. When
Oh,
Grant McMurray was ordained prophet president, that was the breaking from that tradition of the Smith lineage, which was also very much connected to the proof that we were the one true church.
that's true. I didn't really think about that. I
Yeah.
guess, I mean, I knew Grant and Joyce McMurray back before when he was World Church Secretary and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And I remember seeing Grant at World Conference before he was became a counselor to Wallace B.
Mm-hmm.
And he's running around during World Church Secretary stuff, and then like 2 days later, you're hearing his name read in the minute, in the council to the church as being called to the first presidency. It's like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Really.
but yeah, no, I guess I don't even. I guess we're to the point now where I don't even think about the break of lineage in the presidency.
Yeah. I mean, it's so much of this is normalized, and the dial on how we understand and live and respond to God's grace has changed in the midst of this in ways that I think bring us closer to living the way of Christ. A recent one is, well, I want to back up too and go to national conferences, because it's important to remember that Doctrine and Covenants through Steve Beasy provided for national conferences, which was a break from the World Conference always leading the way and making decisions for the whole church, and nothing that we would never do it any other way, to understanding the context and culture of a multinational global church, and how we had to allow for pressing issues in specific contexts and cultures to be dealt with appropriately using national conferences. It turned out to be, and we knew, of course, when he brought that counsel to the church, that a pressing issue in many Western nations was the full inclusion of the LGBTQIA plus community, specific to same-sex marriage and ordination for persons in same-sex relationships. But I think we'll see in the future how that national conference opportunity will open the door to issues that are not a big deal in America, because they may be practices totally foreign to us. And I'm interested to see how that happens. And more recently then too is our stance on alcohol, when the World Church Leadership Council, under the direction of the First Presidency, came to a provision for alcohol that's contextualized by nation without a national conference in the U.S., rather than a prohibition for ordained members to use alcohol. It's the urge to refrain that rests on a body of scientific information about the dangers of alcohol and the importance of modeling. And in some nations, there remains a very strong urge to the point of, we really don't want this to happen. But I think that too was a big deal. It's kind of in partnership with the playing cards thing.
Right. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
our biggest one that just happened was the ordination of a woman to the office of president prophet. That was a huge thing.
Well, I said that was, so I've been going to World Conference since 1978, which was the year Wallace B was ordained.
Yeah.
And one of my, maybe the greatest moment was after we sustained Stacy's call and she came back in the conference chamber. I said it was just electric. The feeling in the building was just electric. And it was just an incredible moment in church history.
Oh, wasn't it? It really was. Just hearing you talk gives me tingles all over. It was just that electricity will not fade.
Well, I had several people suggest, when we were going through the discernment process that, well, they thought it was that Stacy Cran was going to be the person called. And I was like, I don't know. I said that they've got a place in, well, at the time, Boston, now Cincinnati, right? And
Hmm.
which I understand, it's easier to do that today than it was 10, 20 years ago. But I said, it seems to me she's got a foot in retirement here. And I don't know that she's going to want to do this but she heard God's call and accepted it, I guess. And,
Yeah. Yeah. So as you look back on your life now, David, how would you say your involvement with the church empowered you during different phases of your life?
well, I guess it's been the one thing through changes and things that's always kind of kept me grounded. A community that has always loved me. Um, even when you go to places where you don't know too many people, you still find that love and acceptance amongst them. Just this summer, I um, went to in the matter of about 2 weeks, I went to 3 different reunions, and I went down to Camp Bountiful because now I'm a member of the Western Ohio Mission Center presidency, and so I thought that I should at least try and get there for a couple of days, which I did. And I don't know a lot of people from there because I've gone to reunion up in Northern Ontario forever. And but it was great to be there for a couple of days and to get to know some people and so put some faces to some names I knew but didn't really have a relationship with them. I went to Deer Park for the week, which I've been doing for a while. And saw you there, which is always a good thing. And I've gone there for I guess this was the fourth year, because of a relationship I made with Dennis and Meredith Carr through seminary. And then on my way back home, I stopped at Temple Grove for a couple of days. To see President Janae Grover. She was going to be there, and again, I was just overwhelmed by the acceptance that I had, and they were. So I led a campfire song one night, and the next night, this woman who was supposed to lead the campfire was like, "Would you be willing to lead campfire tomorrow night?" So I ended up leading a campfire while I was there. So. The community just grounds me. I always think about having listened to some of the um, Project Zion from early on when you would talk to people who had come over from the Utah Mormon Church, and they talk about how they don't want to leave their tribe. In the sense, the LDS Church, even though they don't agree with a lot of the theology or whatever, it's difficult to because that's their tribe. And I guess when I heard that, I was like, well, this is my tribe. community of Christ is my tribe.
Yeah. So, from your perspectives, what would you identify as the benefits of religious communities in today's world? And you've given a lot of importance to that sense of relationship connection and how that has sustained you. And we heard that in your story, even when you were kind of in your work career and kind of on your own in a way, and you would go up to uh, Naranto reunion, and that helped you make it through the years. So, what would other benefits of religious communities have in today's world?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is remembering the worth of all people. We see so many religions speaking out against certain communities in our world, and they forget, it seems, because I know like all of the major religions basically have a golden rule about loving your neighbor. Yet they seem to, instead of loving all their neighbors, they seem to like to pick and choose which ones they want to love. And I think that's the biggest thing that we face right now, is remembering that all people are of worth. All faiths have worth. It's not just about us as Christians, but all have the right to worship in the way which they wish. And just because we may not agree with that does not mean that as long as they are doing so peacefully and without harming others, that they don't have that right as well.
So, I think you've touched on a bit of the answer to this question, but I just want to go a little bit deeper because I wonder what keeps you active and involved with the community of Christ. And I mean, attending services regularly for you is just part of your activity level. I mean, you are still so deeply involved and very proactive in your relationship with God and the church, proactive in learning and this ongoing life development. I mean, you've went to seminary, you participate with historic sites in lots of different ways, all kinds of things. So what is it, David, that keeps you just so engaged, deeply engaged in your life with this movement?
Well, like you said, I kind of touched on it. It's the relationships with other people, number one. But the other thing is the message that the church is trying to get out to the world. Um, when I think about the mission initiatives and the enduring principles, I just think there's something that the world desperately needs to adhere to. Um, and I'm not sure how we get that message out or how we do a better job of getting that message out. But I think it can be life changing and community changing when we are able to look at diversity and, like I said, worth of people, to understand the oppression that is going on in our world, and that there are answers to poverty out there. We just need to work on um, wage gaps and distribution of wealth, which I know is a bad word for a lot of people, but it's something that seems to me needs to happen when we see so many poor and so few people holding so much wealth in the world.
I do think Jesus had a few things to say about that too. Yeah. So, David, what do you see as the biggest challenge moving forward into the future as a church, as community of Christ, and what brings you hope as we move forward together as a faith movement?
Well, again, I guess it's getting our message out there. As I find it somewhat humorous sometimes when I will hear somebody who's joined Community of Christ say, "Well, we're not expected to proselytize like we were in our old faith or something." And I thought, don't tell the 70 that. They think we are supposed to be still proselytizing, right? Um, and as much as as much as we talk about, that numbers aren't really all that important, in some ways they are. We're diminishing. I would be shocked if the congregation that I attend right now is still there in another 20 years. Probably much less than that, because we're all a bunch of old people and we're not mission oriented in our congregation. What gives me hope is seeing some of the young leaders that are developing. I think of Humberto Tinsman doing his work with emerging ministries. He was in my cohort in seminary, so shout out to Humberto. I think there are some exciting things happening within the church, and it's about getting that message out there and letting people know that there is a community where all are welcome. And hopefully others can find a home with us in Community of Christ.
Yeah, there is indeed a bubbling up across the church of young people stepping out and all a readiness to open and widen our understanding of how community happens, how church happens. That, meeting people where they are and gathering around a table of food and sharing the hopes and dreams of our lives is a way of being the church. And the many ways that I see people experiencing transformation that you experienced in your life as a member of the church, but walking into these new experiences that totally changed how you see the world. Okay, David, is there anything else that you would like to share that I have not asked you about today?
Well, I just want to do one more shout out to my friends up north in Northern Ontario. One of the things that in growing up too was the fact that you got different opinions from people from Canadians than you did from Americans, which I think also helped me in my growth as a person and understanding. And we used to sit up until sometimes 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, around the circle, sharing food and talking and solving all the world's problems, and just such great times. It was kind of funny. One of the women, who's probably in her 40s, probably 40 now, or late 30s anyways, was talking about how, her dad was one of the people who would be up talking with us until all hours of the night. And she said, we'd sneak out of our tent when we were teens. She said, and while you guys were talking, she says, and then we'd have to sneak back into our tents because you guys were still up talking. She said, we wondered when you ever slept. But it's just times like that I just hold so dear in remembering just the good sharing with with the people of the church and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, David, and sharing your story. It's been a true gift and blessing to hear that. And I know that everyone who hears this podcast and gets a window into your life and your journey with the church and with your God will be blessed. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
As always, a very special thanks to you, our listeners, for spending a portion of your day with us. This is your host, Robin Linkhart, and you are listening to Faith Unfiltered podcast. Go out and make the world a better place. Take good care. Bye bye.